16-act summit in terms of every shift and change that you've made over the last 2 days. 224 participants have played a meaningful part in the last 2 days, and that's 224 of you working together. That does not include the press, the media, the people that joined us just briefly yesterday morning as visitors, or indeed the people that have logged in to look at some of these sessions like this one, which are live streamed. That's huge to maintain this amount of energy for that period of time, 224 people. I'm really proud to be a part of it. And just in the interests of getting some participation right in the way, can you please give yourselves a round of applause as we come to the end? So I just want to make sure I have all the rapporteurs from our 5 action area groups sitting here with me in this inner circle. So yes, thank you, good. If anyone else is missing, a couple of people come up. Yep, one more to come. Please, welcome. Sit in here. Yep, excellent. As they arrive, people will crowd in. So let me just explain how the next 40 minutes or so will go. This is not a report out. This is not a report out. This is a conversation. It's a request for assistance and a focus on our overarching philosophy here. But we are going to start, because each of your action areas have designated people, we're going to start with those people giving some key points. Please. So that's what's going to happen first of all. I'm going to then open it up to everyone else. There are a few mics roving around. And the 2 key questions that I'm going to ask as we come to the end of this time together are, firstly, what are you doing as individual leaders? What kind of cultural efforts and actions are you really proud of or committing to or thinking about doing? Because I want to make sure that, again, we focus on what happens next. And the other point is, I know, and this is always the case when we survey participants at the Global Maritime Forum Summit and other events, there are burning things you really want to say just at the end where you think, really, this is a point that must be put on the agenda. We won't have time to go through all 224 of you, but just keep that in mind as we wrap up and think about this. I do want to give that space for some of those really short, critical points that we need to take away with us. Now, as my family knows too well, I work in frameworks. I like to be quite logical about how we order things, and a conversation like this, it's really important for us to be able to think about frameworks as we take away what we've learnt from today. So the framework that I want to give to you, just put it in your head, is one that my colleague Hilda offered earlier today. Hilda's here today. You've heard her on the loudspeaker a few times. But it's called the Vantage Point framework. And at the very top is philosophy. Very top is philosophy. The philosophy of the Global Maritime Forum is probably best expressed by the phrase that you will see in the materials of shaping the future of global seaborne trade. We're really here in an active mode about shaping the future. Now, where and how we are shaping it is a values question. It's a question of where we want to go. And in that area, in the aspect of the philosophy, are all the things that we have kind of taken for granted. The idea of sustainability, the idea of inclusion, the idea of long-term resilience, the phrase global public good, etc., contained within that philosophy. Below philosophy, you come into talking about culture, talking about how we behave and relate to one another, and below that, policy, the rules of the game, the norms, the way we work. And in culture, if we want to just pause there for a second, you can think about those as the principles we bring to bear, what guides us. I often think about the metaphor of driving a car. If I'm driving in Central Europe and I value Krakow more than I value Warsaw, I will turn left when I hit the freeway, and I will drive north to Krakow. So I will go in that direction. If I value Warsaw more, I will turn right. And for me, that choice of where you choose to go, that question is what you value more. How you drive to that destination is a question of your principles. Do I take the scenic route? Do I go for fuel efficiency? Do I flaunt the law? Do I decide to go the fastest way possible? Do I pick up people along the way or not? Just thinking about that's how we behave. And I think those 12 principles that we put up earlier, they're really on that level of culture, which sits above policy. You get through policy, where we're going to land right now, where this introduction is taking us, is to tactics and strategy. Those short and medium-term points that we really need to hit to get to that bigger set of values around shaping the future of global seaborne trade. And how we get there will be expressed in the tactics and strategies that are most prioritized by those of you in these sessions. So let's focus first on that middle level of that framework, on tactics and strategies. And I want to start with the Human Sustainability Group. So we have Harris and Gerardo. So Gerardo and Harris. Yep, okay, perfect. So, sorry, I have the wrong person. Nice to meet you. Good to see you again. So I want to start with human sustainability. And I'm really keen, again, not to do a report out, not to say everything that went on, but think to yourself two questions. One, what was really one of the top priorities for movement or insight that came out of that work that you've done? And second, what do you need help from the rest of the stakeholder group in order to achieve? Because that second question is important because it doesn't just relate to your action area, but what we can pull in together. So, Gerardo, please.
Okay, thanks very much. When we talked about the human sustainability element, one of the things that sort of came out was how do we make sure that we have the right people working in our industry in the years ahead? And key to that, in our mind, was how do we sell our industry? Yes, the principles of ESG are very, very critical, and we thought of that as being the minimum. It's the entry level. I mean, all other industries are talking about that. So let's imagine ourselves in a job fair, and we are here as the maritime industry, and we're beside the accountants and the lawyers and engineers, and we have a whole host of people, and we've got to tell them, well, come to our booth and work with us. So we all have to have the same minimum. So ESG is a given. And based on that, we felt we need to be able to have a narrative that sells ourselves. But in addition to that, one of the things that we also thought about was maybe we should take a look at our industry and see, are we understood by everyone? And what it sort of hit us was the fact that here we are in the Global Maritime Forum, and we should be talking about a global maritime industry. So we should be talking about global maritime professionals, particularly the people who work on our ships. There is a challenge bringing people onto the shore side, but bringing people onto the ships is very, very critical because at the end of the day, that's where all the action takes place. So one thing was, should we look at reforming, amending, or adjusting the terminology we use? For example, yes, seafarer is a technical term used by the IMO, but should we consider them as global maritime professionals? Then when we talk about labor standards, we go to the ILO and we talk about a typical wage for an able-bodied seaman. Maybe we shouldn't be thinking about an able-bodied seaman anymore, but rather an able-skilled professional, because the future is all about able-skilling. And on that basis, we started to then talk about what the industry could do and what individual companies could do. And let me then turn over to Semiramis.
Gerald, thank you very much. I think you covered most of it, which is great for me. I think the other thing we did mention is we were talking about actions that shape the industry, and then we decided that maybe we shouldn't settle to just shaping the industry, but the world. So we talked about that. The other thing we talked about is actions that we can do as a company, and I think something that encompasses all the ideas that came up to were the fact that we could be a great place to work. And I think that sums up most of the things that we discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, much to both of you. So maybe just one follow-up question. In all of that, there's obviously some actions that your group talked about, that if there was a request for investment, action, insight, data, movement in thinking, imagining that job fair or redefining able-bodied seamen to something both more inclusive and more in line with what the industry needs in the future, is there a particular request for what people should be thinking of who weren't the benefit of 2 hours of your work today this morning?
You have an easier question?
No.
I think we need to work as one to be able to sell ourselves. We don't sell ourselves very well. And so we all have to agree on a set of standards that define who we want to be. And you talk about the ESG, and a lot of emphasis is put on the E stuff. And I say, yes, that's going to be the case, but the S is where it all happens. And if we don't have the right people, that we all have to agree what kind of people, how we're going to get them, and what is it going to cost to ensure that we have the right people today while thinking of 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Emma and Hugo from the short-term action side of things. Here we go.
You too.
Emma, why don't you start? So what's one key insight, key thing that you, a priority from short-term action that you want to relate to the rest of us, and one area where you need everyone's help to make that short-term action work?
Okay. We discussed a lot of things. I think the overarching message is commitment from leadership. Commitment from leadership across the industry. This is not something that we're going to be able to achieve as charterers or as owners. No, we need to bring everybody into the conversation. So that's number one. So leaders, please speak to your peers, speak to your stakeholders internally and externally. Start having the difficult conversations. And just on that point, it was very interesting that within the conversation, the sensitivities were already being vocalized within the groups, and you start seeing the tensions, which I think is actually very positive. So let's have that. Let's also be accountable for what we communicate and what we commit to. And being accountable means that we set the goals, we set the KPIs, but we also track against them. So if we're going to say we want to optimize, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Let's start tracking against that as well. So that's in terms of leadership. Aside from that, what else could we do? Digital obviously is going to play a very, very important role. Let's set standards and certain standardized protocols where data sharing becomes the norm. And I'm going to use the Sea Cargo Charter as an excellent example where voluntarily we are holding ourselves accountable. Voluntarily we are sharing data. And voluntarily, we're actually reporting against our emissions publicly within the industry. It's not a league. Instead, we're bringing transparency. The other things that were also discussed, I'm going to pass it on to Hugo so that I don't cover it all.
Well, thank you very much. Everything that you said is obviously very true, but I think we also realize that we're missing some people in the room. And so we need to start by making people aware of this potential. Let's not forget that we're talking about 20 to 25% savings. 20 to 25% saving. That's 200 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere that we can save. It can happen as long as, indeed, there is a commitment from all the leaders, including the ones that are not in the room, because we also realize that shipping is very often the last leg. There is a traders, there is another client, there's all those peoples are not aware of this potential, so we absolutely need to share this very, very important piece of information. And then, if the leaders commit to it, they need to make sure that the entire organization move towards these goals, because you always have the excuse, sorry, cannot change the contract. Sorry, I cannot change this, I cannot change that. So across the organization, you need to find the right KPIs and the right incentive, because that's the big piece, the big news here. If people don't want to do it for the planet, they can do it for their wallet. So it's not someone that needs to pay for it, it's someone that can get the benefit of it, and there is a double benefit. There's your wallet, and there is the CO2. So let's make it happen. Let's not find an excuse not to make it happen, let's make it happen.
Thank you very much, Hugo, that's great. So the call to action there that I heard in particular was thinking through aspects like data sharing protocols, really making sure that we understand where we're not sharing just because we can't be bothered versus where we're not sharing because it's a competitive issue versus the other side where it's actually a positive part of those KPIs that you mentioned to lift everyone up and that side. And the other thing that you mentioned, Emman, is having the difficult conversations. I work with a lot of boards in organizations on governance where the key issue is unstated conflict. It's literally that two people disagree on an important matter and they do not talk about it because it's uncomfortable and everyone knows that these two people, they're normally two men, right? They're normally two men. Everyone knows, and it's because of someone got promoted or because there's some underlying incentive or whatever. And as soon as you can put that on the table, it unlocks a whole series of conversations. I would argue that the same is probably true across a lot of industry relationships to be able to put that on the table, expose the tension. The fear from some people is that as soon as you expose it, it solidifies that tension. It's not my experience. I think getting it out there is better than leaving it festering. So understanding those tensions, those trade-offs, finding ways to solve it, that's fantastic. So let's move to the green corridors. We've got Saskia and Steve. Who wants to start? Steve.
Sure. Do you want to remind me of the question?
Yes,
or
question number one. Question number one, very important.
Yeah.
One key point. Two, what do you need help on?
Sure. On the one key point is collaboration is the key word, and there's so many stakeholders inside the idea of a green corridor. A matter of fact, when we talk about green corridor, there's even defining what that is and saying, well, if you're going to achieve it, what's the route to achieving it as well? So I think collaboration is the key word with that, and also that also means the stakeholders have to be at the table, because the takeaway was that there's multiple stakeholders. You know, of course, we talk green corridors are something to address to get to zero emissions, but of course the holy grail is having IMO have a standard that can lead to the rest of the industry to do that. But the promise of the green corridors is to have that and to demonstrate this and to work through some of those and show the proof of concept and put those into effect that then can spread throughout the rest of the industry. So the big part of that, though, is also what's the key drivers to that? And one of them is definitely the energy and which stakeholders have a role in doing that. So I think that's, and do you want to talk about the energy side of that and just specifically about that, Saskia? Thanks.
Yeah, I think my key takeaway is done is better than perfect. And I don't know how you all feel about the last few days, but there have been many times where people ask me questions and I thought, well, I really do not know the answer to this question. And maybe I should, right? I'm running one of the green corridors. Should I know about this fuel? Should I know about financing options, about regulations? Gosh, another acronym. Oh, another organization. So it's both helpful and difficult, right? How do we bring this all together? Because none of us have huge teams of people to do this. So how do you do this in a way that uses the best energy, but also is collaborative? So my call for action would be reach out to people who run corridors, who run green corridors, if you have something you can contribute. Because more than ever, I realized for the past 2 days that there is so much I don't know. And you can help, right? You might have pieces of the puzzle. So please reach out to me, to others, if you think you can have meaningful action.
Thank you. And I guess the corollary to that, Saskia, is if anyone receives an email from Saskia in the next couple of days, please respond to it. It's very easy to say, look, I'll respond to that later. This is the number one reason why I found that people don't reply to your emails is not because they don't like you or they don't have the information. It's just that they don't have the information right then or the time to be able to come back. So yeah, in this, let's use the momentum from this particular meeting to try and push forward one step in that. And I will bring that point back when I ask you to answer our survey in just a minute as well. Let's talk about the policy side of things, the policy imperative. So I have Ambassador Albin Ashoda, of course, and Klaus Hemmingsen to talk here about the policy imperative. What do you want to pass on? What would be helpful?
Well, first of all, it comes in 4 pieces, so I'll speak to the 2 first. And ambition is, of course, important to define first. So we cemented the ambition of having, in headlines, a 25% reduction by 2030 and a 90% reduction by 2040. And we found that that was actually very, very important to set that trajectory in order to reach the 2050 target. So in that ambition, we said that it had to be a fair and conclusive strategy, and it had to be based on polluter pays. So as somebody mentioned, revising the greenhouse gas strategy in an hour, that's not a small feat. I don't know if we did that. But there were some specific policy measures that goes with it. And we take it for given that by 2026, we will have a carbon tax, and I can come back to what that will be used for if that's of interest. But very importantly, in 2035, there would be a ban on building any ship based on fossil fuel. And that's the hardcore ban. Simply assuming that technology and everybody else will be ready if that ban is clearly articulated soon. And then in 2050, no greenhouse gas emissions will be allowed, and that includes not only CO2, but other greenhouse gas emissions as well. So that was sort of the hardcore stick method that we apply in the policy. And if you ask who to reach out to, we talked a lot about the nations having to put pressure on IMO, and the nations being aligned with their maritime administration. But very important, if you reach out to anybody, don't reach out to people in this room because we're all aligned. We have to reach out to people that are not aligned. So that means talking to our stakeholders, customers, or others, and getting them to contact whoever is not aligned with us, spending time with the non-aligned instead of going to countless meetings with people that we agree with. So that was one call out. And then, Mr. Ambassador, you will cover.
What were the questions again? The 2 questions?
One key thing that you think is critical for people to know coming out of this, one, insight or action, and second, what other people can do in the room to help in making that work.
All right, I'll try and go backward, if that helps. But first, disclosure: I'm a guest. I'm an invited guest. I'm not normally a member of GMF, but I hope I can bring some government lens, particularly from the developing side, the smaller island developing states. So in that context, we were looking at the equitable transition. And I think a lot of people heard me repeat it from time to time, equitable transition. I think one of the things that I kind of realized early on since yesterday is that different people have different idea of what equitable transition is. And you know, there's both the vertical equitable transition from CEO down to the horizontal one, you know, between the different sectors, different players within the sector. But there's also the macro equitable transition, the countries that are also should be part of any transition. So one of the first areas I'm going to try and discuss is the important asset within the sector, which is the seafarers. We addressed or we discussed in the group, you know, to take care of them, to think of them as people too, give them the opportunities to grow, give them, you know, education, leaving no one behind, but making sure that they are well cared for. And I think someone said, you know, skills, upgrading the skills, professional skills. And the other one, of course, trying to address a complex and sometimes sensitive issue in 1 hour resulted in a very good and robust discussion on what does equitable transition for shipping really looks like in a global context. So obviously, to be guided by established principles of transparency, accountability, of course, bringing in monitoring, enforcement, but also looking at a driver to that transition, which in this case is a market-based measure. And what does that market-based measure looks like? You know, we attempted to solve the world's problem in 1 hour, but I think we realized we couldn't do it. But we did come up with some really good ideas, starting ideas that can help elevate the discussion. And obviously, you know, one thing that we also shared was that, you know, we may have these great ideas in this room, and I think others have mentioned it. It's how do we articulate it outside of this room, particularly if we're talking about policy within IMO. Because sometimes, and I'm sorry to be very frank, I hear within this sector people saying that, yes, we need to do this, we need to do that, but sometimes we forget that governments actually make those votes in IMO. So it's a it's a double-edged sword, you know. It helps, but it also helps us to, as others say, talk to the stakeholders, talk to the governments that may become obstacle to progress. But generally, the whole optimism is there. I hope I got everything covered.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's fantastic. You hold on to that mic for the moment. I'm going to pass this over. So we've had Gerardo, maybe over to Marcus and Cecilia there. Oh, maybe Cecilia to start. Ladies first. Before we start, I just want to mention that a couple of people have come up and reinforced that point you made, Ambassador, around the role of the IMO and the double-edged sword aspect of that. So that could be something that, from the audience, people who have had that direct experience with working with nations and governments representatives might want to weigh in on as a key point for us to think about as a way forward. So just keep that in mind. Cecilia, from Trade and Supply.
Thank you. So we talked about trade and supply chain, which is a fairly new subject to GMF, as I understood it. It's a big one. So there were 3 themes: building resilient supply chains, responding to the food and energy crisis, and responding to changing trade environment. So to cover this subject, we needed to have a bit of like brainstorming exercise, looking at some of the long-term aspects we see in the trade environment. And I think the group also challenged some of the, do we see a change in the trade environment? For instance, we've talked about Africa for the past 30 years. Do we see increased growth in Africa despite its potential? And why don't we see that? And what are the obstacles we need to kind of really focus on? We talked about corruption, we talked about government stability, but I think that's also an area which continues to have to be almost like a separate deep dive. We, of course, talked about the challenges in the supply chain. What are the landside effects or the landside obstacles that blocks the potential of ocean transportation? And that's another way where we really need to explore further. Given where we are in the world we are today, there was a lot of focus on the food crisis and the war, which has been mentioned several times during these 2 days. One of the more concrete steps was really that the industry needs a forum to address these challenges. How can the shipping industry play a key role in this? We need private sector, public sector, really strong collaboration, and which international body can serve to facilitate those conversations. Is GMF a body for that? And how do we support WTO's role in escalating that further? Now, Marcus, maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Thanks. I rather flippantly said before I had to stand up here that this might be my last meeting, and you'll understand why in just a second. You know, Winston Churchill allegedly once said that you shouldn't waste a good crisis, and you know, that's one of the great things that this industry has thrived on, taking advantage of times when there is dislocation in the market, when there is supply chain challenges, when there's inefficiencies. And what we're talking about here is finding a way to alleviate some of those challenges. And what we started to talk about was what we refer to as reverse sanctions. So we look at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is, particular products and goods that are particularly valuable for society, and find a way to get those priority treatment. And whether that's through shipping, whether it's imports, whatever it happens to be. So it really would mean taking some of the inefficiency out of the system, and that's what I mean when I say my last visit here, because I do think that is something that this industry thrives upon. So it's really about trying to find that efficiency gain in the supply chain. And as Cecilia said, we were trying to think, how on earth are we going to get that done? And really, it's about trying to find or put a body together that's like a supranational body. And there are, there's the World Trade Organization, there's the World Food Programme, there's plenty of other people around that, may well have access to the necessary bodies, but, it's a perfect forum for GMF to facilitate and be part of. So yeah, I think with that, I'll pass back over to Cecilia.
And just a last comment on that is that also, the industry has done similar. We talked about the emergency response plans when the industry have worked. Different multinational companies have come together with governments on very burning issues such as earthquakes equivalent. But there are ways where we can actually take a leading role in supporting the crisis we're in with very actionable items if we get the public and private sector to work together.
Thank you very much. And just a couple of things that I took away from that. The idea of needing a more focused forum for discussions, particularly on the food and energy crisis. And just a reminder, whenever anyone says, oh, we need a supranational, like another body, a lot of people get suddenly nervous. It's like that old story about standards. You have 12 different standards in an industry, and someone says, we need to bring all these standards together. And then about a year to 3 years later, you have 13 standards in the industry. And it goes on. And I say this as someone who sits on a standards board at the moment. But despite that concern, the point is that it's small groups of people that start off to act together in that collaborative way that then spread out to do that. So I think my sense is what you've already started talking about in terms of ideas like reverse sanctions, ideas about priority access to ports for critical and essential goods. There are conversations that could start to build up and build that momentum, which I think, Marcus, wouldn't make you persona non grata at the next meeting or any future, because at the same time as you're creating efficiencies in some areas, so efficiencies in access for essential goods, you are also creating opportunities for certain lines and first movers to be able to play an important role in resolving this that I think will be to not just everyone's benefit, but as Hugo put it before, there's lots of win-wins in terms of your wallet as well as these other aspects here. So this is great. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to get... Oh, Ambassador, please jump in.
Sorry, I forgot 2 very important issues in my presentation. One is that, in terms of the policy, when we looked at the timeline back from 2015, there's a lot of things that have happened, and I think we should acknowledge and appreciate those achievements. There's a lot more things that need to happen, and that's one point, is that a lot of things have happened since 2015. And the other one is because of the sensitivity of the tax. I really want to bring it out because I think it's an important discussion. Perhaps not now, maybe later, but it's something to think about. Part of that MBM is to help transition the technologies that can allow us to reach 1.5. And I think that's very important. But the other important element is that we have to also think about those countries that need to be part of us moving along, so that really no one is left behind in this transition. And I think, whether we invest in blue economies within, vulnerable countries, whether we create opportunities for mid economies to be able to continue to be competitive, but we have to look and take everyone along this ride. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So I now have 3 key things that I want to throw out to the audience in the few minutes we have left, just for short, sharp interventions from those of you who care particularly about these subjects. The first one I wanted to pick up was the idea of seafarers, because it's been a common discussion point across almost all of those report outs and the discussions I heard. We have some people in the audience and a number of people I've met here today who deal pretty much exclusively with seafarers and their welfare. I want to call if Steve Cotton, if you're in the audience. Where's Stephen? Yeah, Steve, just from the perspective of the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF, just have a bit of a thought on what your take is on and what has to happen in this area.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So first, it's fantastic to be together and make new friends and renew acquaintances. I wanted to just kind of make a bit of a political point about seafarers' retention in the future. We sit here with not many folks with masks on, but there are still seafarers that cannot get off ships. I want to put on record for the thanks to all of the companies that work collaboratively with us under the GMF to move seafarers around. But I also want to take the GMF's name in vain and challenge, sorry, Ambassador, governments to lift all sanctions against seafarers and ultimately call on ourselves to make sure the situation of 400,000 seafarers on board ships never happens again. And that means we have to look at identity documents, key status and those challenges, because I said in a number of the sessions that I felt transport workers have become much more visible because of the pandemic. So we must learn the lessons of the pandemic and we must be able to deliver the sustainability for the maritime professionals so that it's critical that we keep up the pressure, and to have such a significant group of leaders, it would be remiss if we didn't put a message out thanking the seafarers for their contribution, but also calling on governments to remove all sanctions about shore leave, access, and make sure that we take up this work as we go forward. Thanks, Nick. I think that's what you were hoping for.
That's always what I'm hoping for from you, Stephen. The second key point that came out of there is the point that we ended up in trade and supply. We've all been very concerned about this cascading crisis. We started with Rebecca Greenspan really outlining a turbulent future. In the trade uncertainty session that I moderated, we had 4 scenarios and none of them were very pretty in terms of the outlook. And I wanted to call on Dr. Christine Lowe just quickly, just to mention this phrase of global public good has come up a number of times. Here's a microphone coming to you. And I know you've been working on this, so maybe just a couple of quick comments as how it relates to this bigger picture of supporting continued freedom of navigation, trade, and development.
Sure. My elephant in every room that I'm going into right now is the crisis that is at hand. And the crisis will get worse. Through COVID, we learned many lessons. Through the Ukraine crisis, we've learned more lessons. And my colleague here talked just now about reverse sanctions. The idea really is, can we envisage that we're entering a time of even greater crisis? If we are to be brave, what are some of the things that the maritime sector could do? So what we learned from COVID, if we were to start with seafarers, is how about if we have a greater crisis of sanctions, whether the nationality of seafarers will become an issue. So right now we're concerned about Ukrainians and Russians, seafarers, but what if the sanctions were imposed on China? Preemptive sanctions. This is what is being talked about in the geopolitical world. I'm afraid this is probably going to happen. So when that happens, what might change your business, the business of trade, the business of the maritime sector? And what is that space that we might be able to find that allows the maritime sector to articulate something brave to the conflicting countries, conflicting ideologies in the world, but yet find a space that perhaps is part of the value of the GMF, as I understand it, to at least limit harm. And if we were to think of certain essential goods and services, for example, the transportation of food and fertilizers, that could be compartmentalized or ringed off, or it could become some kind of a sanction-free items. Is it possible for us to conceive of the maritime sector finding an appropriate forum where we start to create the narrative, the philosophy, the strategy, the tactic that we will need to articulate that? And is it possible to perceive certain goods as global public goods, that under even different types of crisis, whether they be infectious diseases or war or a new kind of conflict, that is the weaponization of economic tools, where it affects actually all of us. So what is that voice, the narrative, the tactics, the strategy that might be able to start here in just thinking about the maritime sector, that we can start to articulate, because that tsunami of problem might be coming sooner than later.
Thank you very much, Christine. That's fantastic and a real call to action. The third topic that we touched on, we've spent a lot of time discussing in breakout groups, is really the idea of the ambition level that we need to bring, particularly around the decarbonisation and the climate goals. And I want to just call on Tristan Smith from UCL just to remind us, from your perspective and your research at the Energy Institute at UCL, like, where do we really need to be thinking in terms of maintaining that fire and drive to what needs to occur on that side?
So I think I can quote Klaus Hemmingsen, who said it very clearly. I think the number that stands out to me is the easiest way to encapsulate the challenge is to be 1.5 aligned. Does mean 0 by 2050, but it also means 90% reduction by 2040. And that, for this community, that's a global objective, so this community really needs 0 by 2040 effectively. And that is a pretty big challenge. But I don't think it's one that you need to be afraid of. And I think if you communicate fear about that challenge, what you will then get is a failure to inspire the IMO and those who can help you achieve it to embrace it as well. So what that community needs are two things. They need confidence and they need empathy. The empathy is to go back to what we heard from Rebecca yesterday as the UNCTAD Secretary General explained the very circumstances of those governments that you're asking to embrace radical change, the circumstances those governments are facing. And if those aren't incorporated in how we pitch what shipping's transition looks like, if the equity issue is not front and central, then we won't have those government support. We're asking them to embrace radical change. We need to listen to what they're terrified about and factor it into the solution. And I think Ambassador Ishoda, amongst others, have referenced that. The other bit is the confidence, and the confidence is something I think I've heard in pockets, and it feels it's almost being resolved. The key concern that I often hear is, okay, so 90% by 2040 means a massive scale up of new fuels. We can probably build the ships, but I don't know whether the energy suppliers are going to have the fuels available. Well, if you do the maths, that means 10% sustained growth in new production of new fuels over the next 18 years. It means growing production of commodities that we already produce, but doing it at a much higher rate, but not a rate that we haven't done historically. In Pittsburgh this week, there have been a lot of governments and energy companies expressing the mirror image of this group's concern. They're saying, well, we're throwing public funding and investment into green hydrogen. Who are the off-takers? In our maths, 30% or even more of the off-take of green hydrogen will be the shipping industry. So can we get those two communities, those who were over in Pittsburgh, maybe some of their colleagues who are here from the energy industry, in combination with the ship owners saying, okay, it may be 10% annual growth over a sustained period of time. We need to start that now. The green corridors can do that now. We need IMO to pick up the pace after that. But that isn't a number which is terrifying. 10% annual growth isn't different from rolling out solar. It isn't different from planting wind turbines. It's exactly where those transitions have been for 15 years already. So I think if we can create that atmosphere, I think there's a good potential to enable it.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Perfect. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but this is your forum. Does anyone have anything burning on any of those three topics in particular? Sir.
So Mark Brownstein, Environmental Defense Fund. One of the things that I think was missing from the conversation around fuels is the industry's approach to rigorous life cycle accounting as the industry looks at all of the various options. Because if we're going to go to the bother of spending all of this money to achieve environmental and climate benefits, we really need to make sure that we're getting them in the end, and that we're thinking not just about the carbon dioxide reductions, but we're also thinking about the impact on temperature, which has a lot to do with things like methane emissions and the like. And so both of these things need to be incorporated into the life cycle analysis.
Yeah, thank you. It's not just the fuels, it's the efficiency, it's the other forcing gases, etc. It's the whole life cycle. Yeah, exactly. That's great. Another point here, please.
Thank you, Nick. So just a very brief comment that the discussions during the last couple of days have been focused on green fuels, zero-emission fuels. But let us not underestimate the power that carbon capture technology can have as well on board our vessels. So if this technology advances to the extent that we can have it in a practical, a safe, a cost-efficient way, this can also be a game changer in our industry in terms of decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other key points? And then I have to make one key apology, and then I'm going to hand back to Jan.
Yeah, just back on the decarb. Let's keep going. Let's double down our efforts. We've got storm clouds on the global economy. Shipping is going to be tough next 12, 18 months. Let's not get blown off course. Let's keep the discipline and show that shipping can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Great callbacks. So two final things as I wrap up. One is you found your principles. They are your principles, as I said earlier. If you want to give these principles to anyone, please give them to someone who wasn't in the room, and I think that was the call to action. Let's reach out to the people who have yet to be convinced. Finally, I want to give the final word to Semiramis, because I created the classic moderator move, the critical mistake of calling you by the wrong name. So, would you like to say anything to bring us home as we finish, and I hand back to the chair, Jan Dilman.
Jeff.
Yeah.
That was good. No, thank you, Nicholas. I think I'm sure you've organized the program, and I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. No, very good. Well, that's all from me. So it's my real pleasure to hand back to the chair of the Global Maritime Forum,
Turn around
Jan Dilman.
a little bit. Thank you. So I won't take long. So in Nick's words, I'm not going to take the scenic route, but I'm going to take the fuel-efficient route that I'm sure Hugo is going to support me on. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Nick. We had a quick conversation before the session, and you asked me what is important for me, what do you want to get out of it, and I said just go high energy, right? And I think that's what you did. So job well done, fantastic. Give him a hand. Then I also would really like to thank you all for coming here. So first of all, for making the effort, right? It is not easy to travel nowadays, and it's also not very cheap, to be honest with you. So you making the effort coming here, I think means a lot to us and shows the commitment. So thank you for that. That's one thing. The second of all is your participation, right? It is absolute amazing. Look around, right? What we've produced in just a day and a half again. And that's just because your commitment. And every time I'm just blasted away when I see the commitment of people and people coming back and coming back. And sometimes I hear like, oh, we're not making progress enough, it's not going fast enough. But to be honest, these are really complex issues. this is not something you sort in one summit. So I think that keep on going back to some of these things and really making the difference and not giving up, I think is really important for me. So I wanted to point that out. A little bit in the spirit, I would say, from Jeremy, if I just think a little bit back on the last day and a half, we are in rough seas. I think we can't deny it, that is what it is. But I also think that our sails are actually set. And we as a group, we as an industry, I think know what a destination is. And that destination, in my mind, is a global maritime industry that thrives and is an engine for economic growth, but also for human development. So I think we have that in mind, and I can see the sail is set. So what do we need to do to get there? I think my call is on you. We need your leadership. We need your leadership to make this work. We need you to show that can-do attitude, right? Don't forget the can-do attitude. We really need that. So please do that. That is a real request from me. On the summit, I hope that you've actually been able to also make some new connections, some new partnerships, because we all know we can't do it alone. So hopefully you've created some new partnerships. And please also take it up what we said earlier. Try to get other people into the conversation as well. So please continue to do that. I also hope that this conference, summit, and it has done to me again, is giving you confidence that you can actually make those brave and bold decisions when you go back to your businesses and have to make decisions. Because it is a lot of times you feel a little bit alone on these issues, and coming back in this, you get energized and you're like, you know what, let's do it. So I think that's a very important thing as well. So that was a big learning for me. As we're getting closer to the end, everybody's been asking me, where is the next summit? So where is the next summit? It is a little bit of a giveaway, I think, if I ask two people to come to the stage. Anthony Papadimitriou, Simiri Vaspaliou, can you please come to the stage and tell us what's next?
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. It's great to be here. I have to say congratulations to everybody, particularly to the management for doing this great event, which is we've been in great places. We've been in Hong Kong, we've been in Singapore, we've been in London, we've been now in New York, sunny New York, and now we are moving to a place, another country, another seafaring nation that actually was building zero carbon ships 5,000 years ago. Rowing and sailing. And it is in Europe, it is not in Asia. And Semiramis?
So, ladies and gentlemen, we're extremely excited to announce that the next Global Maritime Forum Annual Summit of 2023 will take place in Athens. We look forward.
Please be here.
We look forward to welcoming you, new and old members of the Global Maritime Forum to Athens. So please note it down in your agendas now. No excuses accepted.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you for that. Do we need a picture or are we good? We're good. We're good. We're good. We're good on the picture. Thank you. So this is the really end. So I have a couple of quick shout outs. So first again, thanks strategic sponsors, partners. I said it endlessly, but without you, forget about this. Value Web, Publicis Live, thanks for your support. And of course, it was already mentioned a little bit here, but a real big round of applause for Team GMF. You are fantastic. I have to say, you keep on surprising me, and your energy is actually addictive. So with that, we're going to go have lunch on that side. I hope to see you in one of the upcoming GMF events. As you know, this is not just a one cycle a year. There's a lot of stuff happening in between. Hope to see you there. If not, I'm seeing you next year in Athens. Safe travels back and enjoy lunch.